Marcus, and welcome to WorldView. WorldView is a podcast where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. If you've watched some of our content and liked it, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and donating on Patreon. Today we're talking with Jeff Fountain. Jeff has been living in Europe since 1975 and served for 20 years as the leader of Youth with a Mission in Europe. Jeff is the author of books such as Living as People of Hope and Deeply Rooted, and is currently the director of the Schuman Centre for European Studies. He and his wife Romkje are currently in New Zealand visiting his 98-year-old mother and plan to return to Amsterdam in mid-March. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Jeff, I have to say, in terms of everybody has been going through the most craziest of times for the past year. And I know of a couple of our friends who have been fortunate enough to travel, but then unfortunate enough to then be stuck in wherever they traveled to. Luckily, you haven't been stuck in New Zealand. You plan to go, but you went through the whole process, the whole quarantine process to make sure that you're safe and that New Zealand stays in its uninfected state. What is your experience? I know it's a bit after the peak, but what's your experience like of COVID in New Zealand? It's been declared as like the biggest success in disease management in the world. Do you feel the same? Do you feel that would be the case?
Well, it's certainly a COVID-free paradise. And my wife and I left mid-December to come to New Zealand. We had to jump through all sorts of loops, including actually getting a New Zealand passport 2 days before we left, couriered over to Amsterdam from London, and lots of other things. As we got to the airport, they asked for my wife's electronic visa. We said, "Well, what the heck is that?"
Yeah.
And actually there was an employee there who spent half an hour on the phone with New Zealand and gave us the thumbs up. We got all the way to New Zealand, and once we got here and we tried to find out on the phone from the immigration department, well, how long is this visa of my wife's? They said, well, we've got no record of you being here. You shouldn't be here. And eventually, however, they said, you are a very lucky person. You've come in a very extraordinary circumstances. So we felt like there was a certain window of time. Now, we then had to spend 2 weeks in isolation. We were very fortunate to be in a very nice hotel right at the airport when we arrived, with a nice view out over the harbour. But we had to stay. We were there for Christmas. And so the staff were extremely helpful, extremely friendly to us. But then we stepped out of there into a world we haven't been in for 10 months. People shook hands, they hugged, they gathered in large numbers. And actually we went straight to my brother's 60th birthday out on a beach. He was walking with all his friends around the rocks to another beach. And here we are, really having to get used to this. We haven't been doing this kind of stuff for 10 months. A large gathering, expecting the police to break us up, and going to church with large numbers of people, and not seeing many face masks. But the interesting thing is there is one COVID case they've discovered up north just in the last few days, from a fellow traveler from Holland who came in a month after us. And the whole country, goes into kind of a panic. And people are being told, wear masks and don't go out at night and so forth, or stay home as much as possible. One person, well, it would be very good news in Holland if we had less than 4,000 cases per day. And so this is the kind of thorough reaction, that has kept this place COVID-free. And indeed, it's a paradise. And my wife and I feel somewhat guilty with our friends suffering and our family suffering back in Holland. However, we've really had to just accept, hey, this has been the right time to be here in New Zealand.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. When you told like you had people, greeting by hand and hugging them, and it's a very South African thing to, when you greet someone, to shake their hand, and have a chat. It's almost more. It's such a it's a vision of a more perfect past almost when you think back about it.
That's right.
To be able to do that again, I genuinely don't know if we'll be able to go back to that type of feeling again. It's going to take quite a while.
the Dutch, generally kiss on
Yes.
three cheeks.
Yes, no, exactly.
And whether we'll ever go back to that, I don't know. And some of the women I know say, and we'd be very glad if we didn't go back to that.
Of course.
They don't
No, I
always
can imagine.
appreciate the men kissing them like that.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. But it's definitely changed things a lot. I don't know. I wouldn't mind going back to be able to greet someone properly.
Well,
So
that's the
back
other
to,
interesting thing about New Zealand is, are we glimpsing something here in terms of what the post-COVID society might look like with deurbanization, with lots of workstations at home, education being done in very different ways, and will we really be adopting environment-friendly lifestyles and so on? It's still a bit too early to see. I think we'll probably end up with hybrid churches, some
Right.
online and gatherings as well. But because New Zealand is in the stage it's in, it's an interesting laboratory. And although it's not, I mean, it's still strongly being affected by the lack of tourism, for example. So we can't say it's fully normal. But on the other hand, New Zealanders are spending a lot more money within New Zealand. They're not traveling overseas. And actually the quarter from July to September, I think one of the quarters in the second half of last year, the GDP went up 14%. It had gone down 11% before, and then
wow.
so it's not
Yeah.
it's not totally disastrous. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it sounds amazing. Let's rather go back to your experience in Europe, your main job as when you became the leader of the Youth with a Mission in Europe in January 1999. Sorry, not 1999, rather 1990. That was the year that the Berlin Wall came down, which is obviously, for people like me, I was born in 1994. That's history. That's like ancient history. Is you're like, oh yes, the Berlin Wall came down. I was like, no, that happened quite recently. And you experienced at least 15 years of that living in Europe. What exactly did you experience of communist Europe? Did you stay in that part, or were you affected by it in terms of your day-to-day life?
Yeah, it's actually, your generation is a generation we need to be telling stories to about what took place there. It was actually the end of 1989, of course, when the wall came down. When I took on this job, suddenly there was a new task in front of us. The eastern part of Europe was wide open. In fact, in 1988, my senior in YWAM had said to me, had asked me to consider taking on this job. And I said to him, well, I'll do it on one condition, that you solve all the major problems in Europe first. Well, as 1989 started to roll by, lo and behold, we saw the barbed wire being rolled up on the border of Austria and Hungary. And then the wall came down. By the end of the year, Ceausescu in Romania was dead and buried. And so I wrote to my boss and said, well, I've been very, very impressed. You've kept your side of the bargain. I have no option but to keep my side of the bargain. And these were amazing days. We really didn't ever consider it was going to be possible. Well, let me tell you a story that relates to what you just asked me. My first foray into the communist world was in 1979. I went to Legnica in Poland to hold a worship workshop there. Worship was totally new for Poles, as we had seen it developed in the West. In fact, my brother and I had been involved in 1968 in the beginning of something called Scripture in Song. Now, you're probably too young to remember this, but this was very big in South Africa too. Scripture and song recordings were selling even in the supermarkets there. And those days it was cassettes. And I might have to explain to you what a cassette was.
Luckily, I remember those.
But actually, we had not even seen a cassette when we made these recordings with a couple named David and Dale Garrett. And so we made a 45 RPM with 11 songs on it. And we just simply called it Scripture in Song. And that was really right at the start of this whole new worship movement, went around the world, a whole new genre. This wasn't the only impulse, but it was a major impulse that started this movement really characterized by not just singing songs about God, but singing songs to God, prayer and worship, prayer and music, So I was going to conduct a worship workshop there in Poland, 79. And Then in 1981, I was invited to come and speak to a student conference in Warsaw. Now, 1981 was just when this trade union called Solidarity was being started by the harbor workers up in Gdansk. Lech Wałęsa was their leader, and he had been strongly encouraged by John Paul II, the Pope at the time, and as a devout Catholic himself. And so solidarity is actually a major facet of Catholic social thinking, which we may come back to. And so it was significant that he called it solidarity. Now, this was the very first challenge in the whole communist world of an independent trade union. And so it was May Day weekend, May the 1st to the 3rd of 1981. Mm-hmm. And for the very first time, the Poles were not compulsorily obliged to be part of the May Day parade. And so instead of being this large parade everybody was watching, it was a very small parade, but people were going to events put on by Solidarity to celebrate the Constitution that their country had received 100 years earlier. Now, so I was speaking to the student group there and been asked to speak on a cosmological and historical view of the church. So after looking at my dictionary, I went off to Warsaw, and I was, my friend and I who drove there, we had to drive through the Iron Curtain in East Germany, and everything was gray and everybody was totally inhuman and, just totally impassive. Then we got into Warsaw. It was live with color and red and white posters all over the city that you could see it was a kind of a spring was happening. And the students were all excited, and they said, my friend and I were very afraid for them because we thought, well, what happened in Budapest? What happened in Prague? Aren't you afraid of this? The tanks coming? Oh, we'll just turn the street signs around, they said. And I thought, oh, goodness me. So anyway, I was trying to speak to the subject that they'd asked me to speak on. And I chose Daniel 2, the prophecy that Nebuchadnezzar, or the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, that Daniel interpreted, with the statue that represented the kingdoms of this world and a little stone coming up and smashing all the kingdoms. So here I found myself, caught up in my own enthusiasm, talking about how the Babylonian Empire had come, the Assyrian Empire had come and gone, and the Greek Empire had come and gone, and the Roman Empire had come and gone. And the Third Reich came for 1,000 years, but it was smashed. And then I heard myself blurt out in a communist country, in a public meeting, and the Marxist empire must too be smashed. Oh, okay. And I thought, what am I saying? Yeah. And the students wanted to jump and shout. They said they had to sit on their hands because they knew that the walls had ears. Well, I thought, oh my, what have I said? Yeah. But I had an epiphany right then. I realized I hadn't believed that. I had believed the enemy propaganda that communism was here forever and ever. Amen. Yeah. And suddenly I realized, no, the scripture talks about one unshakable kingdom. And this is not here forever and ever. And from that moment on, I had a new view towards what was going to happen to communism. I didn't know how long it was going to be, but I had a new faith. I remember talking to Brother Andrew about this. Many, perhaps, of your viewers know who Brother Andrew was. He's still alive, but he's very frail right now, but he was God's smuggler. And so it was the beginning of the cracks. But it was going to be another 8 years before the wall finally came down. But I think what's very important to understand is that there were many spiritual movements going on underground that actually led the way to the downfall of communism. People will say, well, it was Gorbachev, or it was Reagan and Thatcher, or it was the arms race. It was, they mentioned all these names who didn't come on the scene until the very last moment, in a sense. I have written a book called A Spiritual Uprising, and I'd be happy to send the ebook of that to anybody who would ask me, because it has about 12 stories of the spiritual movements that were happening in different parts of Europe. And it starts really with Solzhenitsyn. Now, I've asked many people your age, do you know who Solzhenitsyn was? And they say, never heard of him. But when I was, well, I'm younger than you. Let's say when I was 25, his name was a household name all around the world. Bookstores filled up their windows with his books, the Gulag Archipelago and so on. And he was the prophet that began to say, refuse to live the lie, live the truth. And it's amazing how relevant that has become in a time of populism, as we've seen populist leaders speaking lies as if they're truth. And we need to hear the same message again. Now, then there was the Czech poet and dissident, Václav Havel, who later became the president. He picked that up from Solzhenitsyn and said, live the truth, do not live the lie. And he was actually echoing the motto of Jan Hus, who was the Czech reformer way back in the 16th century, who said, the truth will prevail. And again, he talked about truth, and he was burnt at the stake for his own efforts here. Yes. And Václav Havel later picked up Jan Hus's motto, truth prevails, as his presidential motto. And it was on the Czech flag that flew above the council there. Now, then La Valenza, well, I should say John Paul II was a huge factor in this whole thing, as he came and said the same message in Poland, first in 1979, and then he came back, and he actually caused the communist leaders there to shake in their boots, because the church was the one institution that could stand against that of communism. And it's no accident that solidarity started in Poland, that the whole unraveling of communism started in Poland. And so the role of John Paul II was extremely important in the downfall of communism, but that was 10 years earlier. And then you had, later on, you had things like the singing festivals up in the Balkans, in the Baltics, where the people came together and sang in their own languages and expressed their sense of an alternative reality other than the communist state. There's the Baltic Way, which was a human chain from the top of Estonia down to the bottom of Lithuania. And people, the spirit of the people rose up. There's something called the Hill of the Crosses in Lithuania, which was a place of folk religion where crosses had been planted through the centuries for various reasons, but particularly after Stalin exiled many of their people, those who came back put crosses there to thank God for their return and in memory of those who didn't make the return. But the authorities didn't like this, and they kept coming in and taking all these crosses away. But as often as they took them away, more crosses appeared overnight. And eventually they came in with bulldozers and tried to make a moat out of the place. But the more they did that, the more the people would rise up in their spirit and put more crosses there. And eventually in 1986, I think it was, the authorities gave up. And today there's something like 2 million crosses on that hill. And I've been there several times. It's just like a pincushion full of crosses. Now, there's so many other stories. There's the peace and prayer movement that took place, for example, in Leipzig, in the St. Nicholas Church, where they had every Monday night, they had a prayer for peace, and had gone for years. But in 1989, it began to build up, and eventually it built up with crowds of 10,000 people. And then the Stasi and the police and the army came in, and they were trying to provoke a reaction so they could move in with their batons and even shoot. But because everybody had a candle and was trying to shelter the flame, and they were praying, nobody got provoked. And the Stasi didn't know what to do with that. They were prepared for anything, but not with prayer and candles. And this was really then what led directly, actually it was just a month later, to the wall coming down. But even the story of the wall coming down was all, they never intended to open the wall. There was no legal confusion of circumstances. And then there was the Pan-European picnic on the border of Austria and Hungary, where they'd rolled up the barbed wire. And that was in August in 1989. Where people broke through the gates and 600 people crossed the border. So this showed the spirit of the people were rising up. And these were very exciting days, and we keep telling that story because it's one of the moments of grace in post-war European history that we need to pass on to a younger generation. I'll talk later about another period of a moment of grace that was very important, and every European should know about it. So, of course, now the door was wide open, and there were all sorts of groups flooding in there and claiming to have seen so many thousands of converts. And in a city like St. Petersburg, according to the claims and prayer letters back, it must have been evangelized 10 times over. However, people were very, very open, and they said, there must be a God because our government told me there wasn't any. And so there was a moment of ripeness there. And the battle isn't over. Right now, the Ukraine is extremely a pivotal country. And if Ukraine gets it right, it will contribute to the domino effect of the other post-Soviet states who are watching the Ukraine very, very closely. And there's a whole marvelous story to tell about what's been happening there. In fact, just today, I read a letter from a spiritual leader in the Ukraine who told me that in the recent local elections, they had many hundreds of evangelicals were voted in to local councils, and 10 of them became mayors. And there's been a lot of openness to thinking biblically in these areas. Now, I think even as evangelicals, we tend to be naive when it comes to politics and how to get involved. And I think some of the disastrous things we've been seeing happening both in England and in America testify to that. You mentioned before my book, Deeply Rooted, which really tells the story of the birth of the European Union, or let's say the European movement, out of Christian forgiveness and reconciliation. Now, that was translated into Ukrainian 2 years ago. A copy was given recently to the Ukrainian president. And they brought in 150 Assemblies of God pastors from all over the country for a 2-hour seminar to talk about these issues, because they're very conscious that what happened between France and Germany also needs to happen between Ukraine and Russia. And I was invited to speak to some top parliamentary officials, and a woman who headed up the Foreign Affairs Committee there. She said, my daughter goes to bed, cries herself to sleep in fear of Putin, for example. And we need to learn this lesson of reconciliation and forgiveness. So there is something very special happening in the Ukraine. And what's very unusual is that the Orthodox Church of Ukraine has sided with the people and not the state. Usually in history, it was the Orthodox Church was so interwoven with the state. But there, they took the side of the people. And that's been very significant. Not only that, there's a strong working together across all the denominations.
And there's also been I just want to say there's been a breaking down of the status quo in Russia in the past couple of weeks, actually. And this is almost want to say similar in the respect that you said that there's a great movement, there's a great amount of change in Ukraine, and they're so entirely interlinked with Russia. Perhaps the mentality there is also changing. The people that they're supposed to be afraid of, like Putin, for example, that's also being dismantled now with the protest for the release of the opposition leader in Russia as well.
Navalny,
And this is sorry.
I was just saying, indeed, the story is not over.
No, the story is definitely not over, and we see change happening. But as you mentioned, I think that's something that's quite interesting is the history that we enjoy to consume as a younger generation in terms of YouTube videos, and so we see a lot of the certain actions that happened and the people that were involved in something like the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union, in terms of being tied to that. But like you said, those were, the people that came in at the end, like the Thatcher and the Reagan and so on and so forth. So, seeing this development for a decade almost before that, leading up to it, is actually quite interesting. I know that you also started the Schuman Centre for European Studies. in 2010 after you stepped down from your role at Youth with a Mission in Europe. You've touched on it lightly, but the European goal, the European mission, the standing together as European peoples, I know is quite at the center of the Schuman Centre. So could you perhaps explain what the Schuman Centre is and who was Schuman that it's named after?
Yeah. Well, as background, once we, in the early 90s, began to experience this open mission field in front of us, there was one of the leaders of Operation Mobilization, Stuart McAllister. He initiated meetings between different leaders, Campus Crusade, Youth for Christ, OM, YWAM, Greater Europe Mission, and a couple of others. And so we began to meet on a regular basis, and we realized, look, this task is so big, we must do it together. We can't just kind of all go in competing. We've got to do it together. And out of that came something called Hope for Europe. We met together and we said, now, what are the networks that we need to encourage to connect with? It's not just a matter of church planting, but we've got to see people in all different spheres of life working together. So how can we connect all these existing networks so they can learn from each other and make a fist, as it were? And so this Hope for Europe movement came into being. And firstly, we set up networks in about 20 different areas that ranged from politics and socioeconomics, theology, prayer, evangelism, women in leadership, and artists, and all sorts of different ones. Quite a few of which still operate, and they have an annual round table. But we began to hold these round tables so that the left hand might know what the right hand is doing. Now, at the same time, I began to look around to try to see, now, where are the mothers and fathers who have got something of God's heart for Europe that I want to learn from? And it was a bit of a sobering experience to realize that leaders I went to were not thinking about it at all. They might have thought, well, yeah, watch out for Europe, it's the beast. But actually, it was kind of off their horizon. And with a few very key exceptions. And so I went down to Brussels with my leadership team, and we had a meeting there with an official to tell us, okay, what is this Brussels, what is this European community thing all about? What should we think about it? Now, he happened to be a charismatic Catholic, and he headed up a whole prayer network in the European Commission building, where others were suggesting, well, this is where the beast is, a big computer in the basement, keeps track of everybody. Yeah. And he so laughed at that idea. He said, if you knew how incompetent we were without computers. So he welcomed us, shook our hands and says, well, shall we begin with prayer? Well, that was the last thing we expected, from this EU officer. And then he began to tell this story about Robert Schuman, who was the French foreign minister after the war, who had actually been captured and put in solitary confinement by the Gestapo, because he was a very upright, godly man of prayer, and he was not prepared to work with the puppet government. He wasn't prepared to compromise, and they knew he was going to be a problem, so they had to put him aside. Now, he knew what to do in solitary confinement. He was a man of prayer. And some years ago, I had lunch with a journalist who was quite a bit younger than him, but he's a very old man now, who worked with Robert Schuman. And he said, I read with my own eyes the notes that he smuggled out of the confinement there, saying, we French will have to learn to love and forgive the Germans to rebuild Europe after the war. Now, that was like just treachery, I mean, that's like a Republican, being prepared to say, we've got to get rid of Trump, With that within a country. But imagine if that is two countries that have been warring with each other
for centuries.
For centuries, fighting like, alley cats and dragging the rest of the world into their conflicts. But because Robert Schuman was trained in Catholic social thinking, that is an understanding that came out of the Catholic Church at the end of the 19th century, as the Catholic Church was trying to get to grips with the Industrial Revolution and all the fruit of that. How do we respond to this changed world? And they started off with an understanding of human beings created in God's image. That was their starting point. The people created in God's image were at the heart. And out of this comes a commitment to work for the common good of everybody. So the image of God and the common good were two of the main pillars of their whole teaching. Now, I've been raised in a Baptist church. I'm still a missionary member of the Auckland Baptist Tabernacle here. And it was never taught this way, but what I had picked up was, nothing good can come from Catholicism. But I have had to learn that actually, as evangelicals, we've gotten a lot of things wrong. And actually, sometimes Catholics have gotten things right, and even liberals have gotten things right. And we have to have the humility to recognize that we can learn from other traditions. Now, if we go to the papal encyclicals, which are letters from the Pope to the faithful all around the world, actually initially for their leaders, but Pope Francis particularly, he writes not only the faithful, but he writes the unfaithful as well. He writes to everybody in the world. There are here and there, bits I want to set to the side, but by and large, there's some magnificent biblical thinking going on here in areas that we don't go. There's a Catholic historian named Christopher Dawson. He said this: Catholics see woods, Protestants see trees. What he meant by that was, when the Reformation came along, the Protestants focused on their own nation. You had the Church of England, so God was an Englishman. You had the Dutch Reformed Church, God was Dutch. You had the Lutheran Church in Germany, which was really the state church, the same in Scandinavia. And so the focus came on the nations, whereas Catholics realized that they were part of something much bigger than their own nation. Now, over the years, you had all sorts of free church movements splitting off for very good theological reasons, but it meant that as evangelicals, our focus was on the local church. So I would add, not only do Catholics see woods and Protestants see trees, evangelicals see branches. Now, we have to learn to see the woods. And so in 2010, just 11 years ago, when my 60th birthday was coming along, I thought, hey, this is supposed to be youth with a mission. What am I doing, leading youth with a mission as a 60-year-old? It's time for me to get out of the place. But I still had all these networks that I've been building up in the years before. And there's so much that still needed to be done. So that's why we set up this virtual Center for European Studies, and we called it the Schuman Centre, because we wanted people to say, well, who the heck was Schuman? Yes. Glad you asked. Let me tell you a story. And, by and large, we never heard that story. My kids were all educated in universities in Europe, never heard that story. And it's the birth of what has become the EU is actually, that's our second moment of grace. But it actually happened first. And we wouldn't have had the downfall of the Berlin Wall unless this other story had happened back in 1950. Because what happened then, I mentioned Schuman was in prison during the war. He escaped, and then he was spending the rest of the war. He actually tried to alert the Allies about things he knew about what the Germans were doing to the Jews as well. But he'd become convinced Germany could not sustain the war effort, and he began to plan for what kind of Europe should be rebuilt after the war. And so he was asked to join the cabinet, the post-war cabinet. First, he was finance minister. He actually became prime minister for 7 months. There were many cabinets falling and so on. Yeah. But he saw that the main task he needed to do was work on reconciliation between the Germans and the French. And so he settled for being foreign minister. And he began to develop a close trust relationship with Konrad Adenauer, who was the first chancellor of Western Germany, once it was given freedom from the occupying powers. And and Konrad Adenauer had been strongly influenced by a movement called moral rearmament, which initially was a Christ-centered movement stressing forgiveness and reconciliation. And there's a place in Switzerland above Montreux, the eastern end of the eastern end of Lake Geneva, That was the Centre for the Reconciliation of the Nations. It's still there. It looks like a big Disneyland building that was built for a hotel for 120 years ago. But that's where people came from all different nations together to hear each other's stories. And they came from Germany. They came even from Japan. They came from Britain and Italy and France and many other countries. And Adenauer just lapped this up. He went there with his family many times. Not only him, but there were other politicians and many labor unionists and theologians and journalists and all sorts of people from different areas of life. And this led an impulse for forgiveness and reconciliation. We could spend the whole night just talking about that. But this meant, because Adenauer also was a Catholic, had the same kind of Catholic social thinking background, and the leader in Italy, Alcide de Gasperi, the same background, these three men had a common understanding. And this is what led to Schuman making his plan, and which I'll mention in a second. Adenauer said to Schuman later, "I consider it providential that the main task of rebuilding Europe on Christian foundations rests on the shoulders of men like you and me and our brother Alcide, who believe in restoring a Christian base for Europe." Now, what Robert Schuman's vision was for a post-war Europe was to become a community of peoples deeply rooted in basic Christian values. Now, that didn't mean a Christian dominion. That didn't mean, we hear these days about 7 mountains, and it's meant well, but often that is that we Christians are going to get the key positions and dominate these areas again. That's not what it was about, but it was recognizing that we had to present Christian principles, not as Christian principles, but for their own intrinsic value, and rebuild Europe in this way, seeking the common good, recognizing every individual as being the sanctity of human life. And out of that came then 2 principles that embedded in EU language. One is solidarity. We mentioned that before with Lech Walesa. And the other is subsidiarity. Now, those are words you often come across in EU language. Subsidiarity means decisions need to be pushed down as locally as possible. It's actually a sin to steal people's responsibilities. That was the teaching of the Catholic Church. I should mention, by the way, that little story in Poland I was telling about with Lech Walesa and my epiphany. The next morning, my friend and I went into a hotel to have some breakfast there, and it had solidarity stickers all over the doors and so on. And while we were eating, in the door comes this man with a walrus mustache that we recognized from the cover of Time magazine. It was Lech Walesa with a number of his friends sat at the table next to us. And and I'm looking at this man and I'm thinking, what's going to happen to him? Will he disappear in the middle of the night? Will we hear about his body being dragged out of a ditch somewhere? Will he be thrown into prison and so forth? I never dreamed of thinking I was looking at the future president of a democratic Poland. You see, we all have a tendency to look to the future negatively. We don't realize what God wants to do. And this began to, so turned around my thinking. Meanwhile, back to the Robert Schuman Declaration. On the 9th of May, 1950, Robert Schuman called a special press conference. And there, in the space of 3 minutes, which is far shorter than I've been talking.
Yeah, well,
can you boil an egg in 3 minutes? Can you make a piece of toast in 3 minutes? Can you make a cup of coffee in 3 minutes? In 3 minutes, Robert Schuman laid the foundation for the European house, in which today, 500 million Europeans from 27 nations are living together in peace. Now, that is a miracle. And if we didn't have an EU, we would have to reinvent it. It's certainly not perfect. But from that moment onward, there was a plan on the table. And the plan involved this. We have to be prepared to share our sovereignty. We're going to start in the area of coal and steel industries because those are the key industries to build a war machine. Now, if Germany and France would actually share those those industries under a common supranational authority, neither nation could ever go back to war with each other. And especially if other countries were invited to join. So that's what happened. France, Germany, the Benelux countries, that is the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg and Italy, all formed the first 6 going in together. And that then has grown to 9 and 10 and 12 and 15 and eventually up to 28 and now down to 27 again. But at the heart of it is shared sovereignty. Now, the British knew this all from the start, but they really tried to make it just into a loose, much more looser free trade, agreement. Maggie Thatcher did her best. But at the heart of it was a certain amount of shared sovereignty for European issues. Local issues, that's the principle of subsidiarity. That should be decided locally. And the Dutch don't feel any less Dutch for being part of the EU. In fact, most of them, kind of feel like, well, Brussels, that's too far from my bed. That's an expression that they use. So I will ask them, I bet you bought your bed at IKEA. Don't you think that's a little bit Europe? So this is why we set up the European, the Schuman Centre for European Studies as a virtual center to jog people's memories, to stir people's imagination, to awaken people, to stir people's conscience and awaken people's imagination. So jogging memories, that's the past. Stirring conscience, that's the present, responding to today's situation. Awakening imagination, that's the future. What kind of Europe do you think God wants? And what kind of Europe should we be working for? And what I realized was, in my background, my constituency, we were actually irresponsible. We sat on the sidelines, we pointed the finger, we criticized, we said, oh, this is revelation such and such coming into being. And we were wrong again and again and again. And we were not responsible. We were not part of the answer. But the Catholics were. And thank God for the Catholics. The situation in Europe was far worse if it hadn't been for Catholics bringing in biblical thinking about how to operate together. You see, here is a limitation we have as evangelicals. We have shrunken the gospel. You're probably too young to remember a film called Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Ever heard of that?
Love it.
Yeah, okay,
Favorite.
all right. But it was made before you were born, probably.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, honey, we shrunk the gospel, you see. We made the gospel a gospel of personal salvation. Get your ticket to heaven, and you spend the rest of the time at church listening to the preacher trying to convert the non-believers who are supposed to be there in the congregation, but probably aren't. But Jesus didn't preach that kind of gospel. He preached the gospel of the kingdom, which was the shalom of God. That is the restoration of God's purposes for all spheres of life. And we read about everything under heaven and on earth being restored under Christ as Lord. And this has been at the heart of Dutch Reformed thinking, or starting with Calvin, John Calvin, and embellished by Abraham Kuyper, who was a Dutch prime minister over 100 years ago, 115 years ago, who said there is not one square inch of human life where Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not say mine. But as evangelicals, we didn't know how to think biblically outside of our narrow box of church and personal salvation. So evangelism and church planting became our main goal. But it's very interesting when you think of people like John Wesley or William Carey. They were far more interested in the totality of life than just pure salvation. John Wesley had an incredibly broad interest in science and medicine and all sorts of other things. And if you hear what William Carey did in India, and he's considered to be the father of the modern missionary movement, he introduced the first steam engine to India, the first printing press to India. He started the first school for girls and boys. He was a botanist and identified new plants there. He started the first lending library and newspaper and lending bank, savings bank, and many other things, because he had a holistic understanding of God's purpose for human society, and said, this is the good news that we are bringing. how to redeem all of life. And so what we're trying to do in the Schuman Centre is offer training and resources and events that will help people recover an understanding of what God has done in the past and where he wants to go in the future, and therefore to equip us to respond to the challenges of the future in the light of God's future. So we need to become people who are rooted in the past, focused on the future, in order to be effectively engaged in the present.
Mm. And I'm also quite interested in seeing that, you know, the lessons and the teachings that you or rather the services you provide at the Schuman Centre. You know, you mentioned that the Catholics had the view of the woods of the world, the Protestants had the trees, and evangelicals maybe have the branches. You know, I want to almost transfer that in terms of politically. You also have, you know, the wood is the European Union, the trees is individual countries, and the branches are the independent movements. Almost all across Europe has different ones. I mean, France has them, Spain has them. You know, even the UK have them. So my question then is, should the wood perhaps turn, or rather, do you think that the wood should perhaps turn into a forest, in the sense where this environment that you say, where people need to connect, people need to combine and have good Christian morals, but not necessarily a Christian state? Should the European Union become a sort of a United States of Europe, or go somewhat further than just the current state it is in? Because I mean, at the moment you already have free trade, you have free movement, and the European environment is also already established. But should it become more than that? Should it become one country, or is it actually good as it is? It should just have more members in its spirit.
Yeah, no. Actually, the vision that Winston Churchill had after the war, and his last passion was to see the United States of Europe established. And he said to his wife, if I had been 10 years younger, I could have been the first president of the United States of Europe. Now that shocks a lot of people,
Yes,
but
no.
he took the initiative to see an event take place in The Hague in 1948. And I went to the 70th in 2018. So yeah, that 70th anniversary of that in The Hague, in the same Ridderzaal, the Knights Hall, where he held this first meeting. And this is actually what gave birth to the Council of Europe. Now, it's a bit confusing. The Council of Europe is not the same thing as the European Union, even though they have similar flags. The Council of Europe is really what resulted from Winston Churchill's vision to see the nations of Europe begin to relate together. And it was really based on the European Convention of Human Rights that was signed at the same time, all of which are based on biblical understanding of humanity. And that still exists, and you have countries that are all signatories to it, 48 countries, I think it is, including Russia and Japan, and Russia and Turkey, who are glaring, delinquents when it comes to human rights. But the idea is, well, it's better to have everybody in this club talking to each other than to keep pushing them out. But Schuman saw that wasn't enough. And it's a little bit like the argument that a lot of Brexiteers have been using. We really want to see Europe just as a kind of a conglomerate or a confederacy of independent nations who can make all sorts of trade agreements and so forth. But what that comes back to is that the biggest nations become the most powerful, and the smaller nations then actually come under the hegemony of the bigger nations, and you end up having power blocks like the Triple Entente and Triple Alliance of the First World War. Yeah. And it's only when you actually share, when you can embrace what Schuman called a spirit of Europe, that is, where all together we are seeking the common good of the whole. That's what needs to be promoted. So the idea of United States of Europe as one nation is, let's say, a fully federal Europe. And I think that Schuman was very much moving in that direction. But Schuman would have said, this is really only possible if we share common Christian foundations. Now, this whole movement has been a consensus movement, democratic. He said it needs to be slow, it needs to be democratic, it needs to be transparent. Well, at times we've gone very fast. It certainly hasn't been transparent, and it's not always been democratic. So although he put a plan on the table in 1950, we haven't always followed his plan, but it was the trigger, it was the catalyst that got this movement going. And still, people give lip service, at least, to the values. Now, you've got to work with the people that you have. You see, it's not like, well, that's because Schuman Centre and so on said this is how it has to be. That many leaders today would say, but we have to make our own decisions for Europe from now. Sure. So you've got this whole process of consensus, and everybody has to be involved. No wonder, it goes zigzag and all over the place. It's not a very effective way. It's much more effective to have a dictator, a Napoleon, do it. But if you're going to have true ownership, everybody needs to be able to be involved and say, yes, these are the values that we want to live by. And so that's why it's a value-driven or value-defined club, if you like. What we're trying to do is point out these foundations that Schuman talked about. He said, this cannot just be an economic and technological project. It needs a soul. Now, he understood the soul as that which had actually brought life to the physical being. What was the source of this life? What was the life spring of European civilization? And his understanding was totally the gospel. And so we're trying to make people aware of the role of the story of Jesus in making Europe Europe. And I would say this, the story of Jesus has been the single greatest factor in shaping Europe's past. So my question is, why can't that same story be the single greatest factor in shaping Europe's future? Now, that kind of statement will run straight up against a wall of unbelief, because we've been so conditioned to think of the future as being negative. Why do we think that way? We need to read our Bibles and see the bits that talk about the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. And of the increase of his kingdom and shalom, there will be no end. And sure, we're not going to see the kingdom fully come in until Jesus returns. But we should expect an ongoing growth, because that is what has happened. I mean, go back 2,000 years and you see this movement. It's incredible the way it's gone out. And sometimes it's 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. And certainly the church has not been the best ambassador of the gospel of the kingdom all the way through. And very often we redefine that gospel to make it church-centered instead of kingdom-centered. And yet, look at the Bible, look in the Gospels and ask yourself, what did Jesus say about the church? Now, I have a little book. Bit of a fun book. Let me see. I'm just grabbing something on this desk here. I'm staying with family here. Okay, here's the Sudoku book. This book says what Jesus said about the church, and you open it up, and it's a lot of empty pages. Well, it starts with Matthew, and there's 2 verses, and then it goes on to Mark and Luke and John. They're all empty. And he said, well, what is this? Jesus didn't say almost anything about the church. He talked about, I will build my church, and he talked about church discipline, Matthew 16 and Matthew 18. That's it, folks. Nothing more. What does that mean? Because Jesus loved the church. He gave himself for the church. He's the head of the church. He's coming back for his bride. Well, what then was his message? And then you turn the book over and it says what Jesus said about the kingdom. And there's more than 100 verses that we follow through there. All right, what does this mean? It means we have been sidetracked in thinking that the gospel was all about getting people into our church. We thought we need to have church-centered activities and so on. That's not what it's about at all. And we need to learn how to see kingdom truth permeate every sphere of life. Now, this is where we come back to an evangelical blind spot. We don't really know how to think biblically outside the church, outside of personal discipleship, outside of evangelism. Where do we have courses in public theology that look at our nation and ask, what is the state for in God's eyes? And what is the difference between, what is the separation between the state and the church. We've had a lot of pronouncements being made from pulpits recently with American politics and even Brexit that go beyond the church's competence. And we've had people who are pastors who are not qualified to speak in the political area at all. But we need to raise up apostles and prophets and teachers and so on in the political area, in the economic area, and all these other spheres. But it's not going to be the church always in the center. Yes, it'll be the scattered church. It'll be the body of Christ, but not the church with a building with four walls and so on. Now, this was the vision that Abraham Kuyper had 120 years ago. Well, he actually died just 100 years ago, last November. And so we've been having exhibitions in Amsterdam about Abraham Kuyper and his influence in journalism, his influence in politics, his influence in education. He started the Free University in Amsterdam, and his influence in the church, of course. And he started the Gereformeerde Kerken from Nederland, which I think was carried over into South Africa in various forms. Yes. Yeah. He was actually a champion of pluralism. And as a South African, you may know that he's also been accused of being the father of apartheid. No, but that was not his vision. It was not applied to races. It was applied to life spheres. The section that you lived your worldview out in every sphere of life, and that was going to be distinct from a humanist view and so on. However, that's not what we're really talking about tonight. We're talking about Schuman and the Schuman Centre. So I talked about jogging memories. One of the things we do is we take people on tours through Europe. We've been doing this for over 15 years now. We started doing a continental tour, and then we realized, oh, there's a prequel to that story, and that's the Celtic tour. And so with the COVID, well, it's usually been a 2-week tour, and we are looking for the stories of faithful minorities who shaped Europe through their faith. And I just love to show people how the Bible so shaped Europe, and yet we just don't know it, and our teachers don't know it, and our politicians don't know it, and our media people don't know it. And it's like we all sit in this 3D movie without any glasses to see the extra dimension. So we're trying to help people see the extra dimension, and that is, I love to start in the city of Utrecht in Holland. I think it's the best place in the whole of Europe to show how Europe got her soul. And there we see evidence of the conversion of the Romans and of the Copts and the Irish and the Scots and the English and the Franks and the Frisians and the Germanic tribes, the Saxons and so on, and even the Vikings, all sitting there in that city. And how did Europe, the values of Europe, get shaped? Now, people say, yeah, it's our classical roots, this Roman and Greek. Well, the Roman and Greek civilization didn't give us three vital understandings. One is the image of God. Every human being is created in the image of God. That's the only basis for talking about sanctity of life and human rights, which did not originate with the Enlightenment. It originated earlier through Christians. That's a whole talk we could talk about. It was certainly picked up, especially Voltaire and Rousseau. Where did they come from? They came from Geneva, Calvin's Geneva, and they loved Geneva. So that's the first thing. The second thing is moral equality. Paul said, in Christ is neither Jew nor Gentile. Now, this was radical, and there are non-Christian philosophers who say Paul was the greatest radical in history because of that. And I would say a third aspect is the concept of agape love. I have a professor friend in Amsterdam who traces the shaping of the European cities and so on through the concept of agape love. Now, so there's a whole story that we've lost, we've let slip through our fingers, that we need to recover. And so we go on these tours and we go through all different centuries. It's not just a Reformation tour. There are many wonderful things happened in the centuries before. But then we realized there was a prequel to that story. We got to go to Ireland. and Patrick and the Celts, and then up to Scotland, and then down through England, the conversion of the English, and then across onto the continent with people like Willebrord and Boniface, Alcuin, who's the right-hand man for Charlemagne, and then Columbanus, the Irish Celt, who came down through France and Switzerland and Austria and Italy. In fact, there's a film called The Monk who saved Europe. You might be able to find it on the web. The Monk Who Saved Europe, done by the former president of Ireland, Mary Macaulay. And that's a wonderful story. But my experience is that hardly anybody knows these stories. You see, we've been robbed of our heritage, and we need to recover it. Yeah. So that's what we're trying to do in the Schuman Centre. And with COVID coming, we couldn't go on our tour this last summer. No. So we've ended up pioneering an online Celtic tour. In fact, next week, I'm going to be doing that 2 days a week, 5 days. We're going to go to Ireland, then we go to Scotland, Northumbria, Middle England, and then we go to the south as we trace the story with a number of our master's candidates.
Yeah. And that's actually such a wonderful story because I really feel like the individuality, the wonderful identity in the different European nations is not exactly lost, even though people start to, or people would like to advance more and more and more of this single European culture. And I think the basis thereof is what you say in terms of that the unification, the soul of Europe is built on good Christian values and a Christian moral stature, and not necessarily that they should take over the states and dominate the way that things should be done, but rather just the identity and the heart of it. And people tend to forget that the very heart of the largest part of Europe for the longest time used to be the Holy Roman Empire. It's not the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. So there's an innate connection there as well, which is so incredibly important as well.
That's one of the reasons why Protestants reject it all. They say, oh, this was the revival of the Holy Roman Empire, and they see this from Revelation and so forth. Now, nobody, I don't think, is really promoting just a one European culture. God is a God of unity with diversity. In fact, that's the motto of the European Union, is unity with diversity. But that's only possible on one basis, and that is Trinitarianism. It's not even possible on monism or monotheism, but Trinitarianism, one and united in diversity. Now, each one of us as individuals, we need to develop autonomy. We need to learn to brush our teeth and clean our rooms and develop financial competence and so on. Yet at the same time, we all need to be connected. We're connected in families, or marriage, or connected in clubs and so on. So we need to have a balance between autonomy and connectedness. Now, most countries have some kind of a day where they celebrate autonomy. It might be Bastildag in France. It might be a Unification Day in Germany, or King's Day in Holland, and so on. But at the same time, we need to have a common celebration of our connectedness. So we actually have a website, may9.eu, where we should suggest all sorts of ideas to make the 9th of May, which is the date that Robert Schuman made his declaration, the 9th of May as Interdependence Day, or Family of Europe Day, or Together for Europe Day. And we've suggested all sorts of ways. We just start at the grassroots. This is not a top-down political thing. This is a bottom-up cultural thing. Imagine, you have all sorts of flash mobs outside railway stations or libraries or something with an orchestra playing Ode to Joy, which is the European anthem. Or you have a wine and cheese evening with wines and cheeses from different countries, or a film evening with films from different European countries, or music from different countries. Some way of celebrating the fact that we have all been enriched by being part of a bigger family. I mean, we love to drive German cars and watch British detectives and drink
French
Spanish wines, or French cuisine and Swedish saunas and so on. All of these things have become part of our daily lifestyle because we're connected and we've become enriched by it all. Italian pizzas, etc. Just think how much our world has been shaped by the fact that we've opened our borders and we interconnect. So why shouldn't we have a day where we celebrate our interconnectedness? So this is one of the ways we're trying to encourage this. And actually, we're part of something called Together for Europe, which is a consortium of about 200 or 300 movements, Catholic and Protestant and Orthodox together, mainly communities, not local churches, but movements and communities. And that this Together for Europe movement has been picking up this idea of May the 9th and really encouraging this in different places. Now, it's still small beginnings, but this is the kind of thing that we're trying to encourage, a different attitude. May the 9th is actually officially Europe Day, but that's one of the best kept secrets in many European countries, including founding countries like the Netherlands. Nobody in the Netherlands knows what that day is all about. But some of the newer places, even a country like Turkey knows, but the newer countries, they're very aware of that.
Yeah. And I just want to know, like, in contrast to this, the movement Together for Europe, you have, I don't exactly know how to describe it, but the populist movements in general, led by people like Nigel Farage and Marine Le Pen in France and so on, those seemingly have a lot of traction, and they're small movements, but they're very passionate and very small. And they are portrayed in media as the undermining of this togetherness in Europe and the European Union, both in a political sphere and as a cultural sphere. And they obviously cite a lot of issues with the European Union, such as for so many states to exist together, the bureaucratic nature thereof creates so many obstacles for progress and so on and so forth. How do you feel is Together for Europe in direct opposition to these type of movements, or do you feel like these people might have the right idea but they're just employing it in the wrong way?
Well, our starting point would be diametrically opposite,
Right.
but this is not speaking to them and in opposition, but it's trying to actually present an alternative that would be attractive to people. They represent the unpaid bills, if you like, of the European Union. And really of the Christian community. We have failed in being able to present the idea of being united with diversity. And it's also a measure of the new stage as we've moved, just as it was with the Industrial Revolution. Now the Information Revolution is dislocating many industries, many. It's seeing the greater inequality of incomes and so on, and whole regions. It's like the north of England, which voted very strongly for Brexit, compared to London. And the north feels left behind, left out. And many rural areas have been feeling this. And so often government people, tend to come from the elite and so forth. And so there's been this, it's an anti-elite, but it's actually expressing frustration. These people have come, the populist leaders come to the fore and say, we represent you, you are the people. And it's us versus them. And it's constantly a polarization. It's finding a scapegoat. And that's a common aspect here. You've got to find a scapegoat. Who are to blame? Now that's very, very dangerous, as we've seen the Jews get blamed, the Gypsies get blamed, etc. So this is far too small-minded. We need to be thinking bigger and embracing rather than rejecting and us versus them. And unfortunately, it's been a quick way to get political clout. And Trump certainly discovered this. Yeah. And Farage has never had a large following himself.
No.
But
the independence.
Boris Johnson certainly has. He really taps into this kind of populist theme as well. In France, we see it very clearly. In Holland, with Wilders. One of the larger parties still in Holland, because it's a conduit, it's a lightning rod of frustration. And we need to listen, we need to understand what is being said here, how are people feeling? And but I would reject their basic presupposition that the way to go to the future is to go back to our own national identities and defend our borders. This is just going back to competition between nations, going to lead to ongoing wars, etc., etc. And, you know, Psalm 133 talks about, behold how blessed and good it is when brothers dwell together in unity. What about when nations dwell together in unity? What is God's purpose? What kind of Europe would God want? And not only that, you know, the European project has been a model for many other parts of the world. And it would be very disappointing in other parts of the world if that project began to disintegrate.
Yeah.
And of course, we have populist leaders in other places like Putin and so forth, who would love to see the thing disintegrate. And so, you know, the Kremlin's been very active in wooing those parties and actually supporting them financially. And that's been well documented as well.
Yeah. We just want to thank you. It's been such an interesting discussion. Lastly, I just want to ask, how do people get involved with the Schuman Centre activities or contribute, or what exactly would help most?
Well, yeah, we let's start at the broadest level. I write a weekly blog called weeklyword.eu, and people can go there and sign up. I've been doing that for over 20 years, and so there's a search function. You can look for all sorts of subjects and find out what I've touched on in the past. I was a journalist on the New Zealand Herald before I left New Zealand, and so this has been I started it to try to keep in touch with my YWAM folk all across Europe and Siberia, but then realized this is relevant for a lot of non-YWAMers, and then I found a lot of people around the world interested in tapping into that. So that's one thing. If you go to the SchumanCentre.eu website, you'll see all sorts of activities and resources there. We are a small group. We are networked with people up in Finland, in Estonia, in Romania. We used to have a Schuman lounge in Brussels as a place where we would run courses as well. Unfortunately, our colleague there had to change plans. So we run each summer also a summer school for European studies. I do that actually with a professor friend, Evert van der Pol. And we started to do that this last summer. We had a hybrid school. So that'd be possible for people anywhere in the world, perhaps to join in on a week of teaching where my colleague Evert has written a book called Christian Faith and the Making of Europe. And he does his teaching and I do mine. We do these tours, and as I said, we have this tour coming up next week. Actually, the first week of March, the 1st to the 5th, we're going to take a continental tour, and that's going to be 2 hours each day, and we'll go right through from Holland, Germany, down to Prague, and then back through Germany to Switzerland, France. And you develop a camaraderie with everybody else, you know, in the Zoom meeting, going on this trip, and send all sorts of teaching aids and PowerPoints and e-readers and so forth to help with that. And we offer a very modest fee on that. So those are possibilities. And we don't know when we're going to be able to resume having these tours as a physical tour. We can't assume that at all. But meanwhile, COVID has forced us to find new ways of doing new things in new ways. And it was far more effective than we had ever hoped. So in fact, it's going to be a module for the master's degree program that we offer for one of 6 modules. And we have a course called Missional Leadership and European Studies, which we offer through 4 Mission College in Birmingham, and is recognized by Newman University as part of a Bologna master's degree. So those are some of the ways that people can be involved. Plus, we have a Schuman talk each month on the 9th day at 6 p.m., and that relates back to the 9th of May, 1950, 6 p.m. press talk, that's when Schuman launched his Schuman Declaration. And so on the 9th of February at 6 p.m. in in Europe, in Central Europe, Amsterdam time, where you can work out where you are, is that same, you're 1 hour different, I think.
I think it's a 1 hour difference.
Yeah, yeah.
Just
We'll be
earlier.
interviewing David Koysis this time. We've had some very interesting people. Tom Holland, the writer of Dominion, for example, in which he shows the influence of Christianity in shaping the West. But we'll be having the writer of a book called Political Visions and Illusions, David Koysis, a Canadian professor, who's one of the clearest voices in understanding politics from a Christian point of view and all the different isms as idolatries, which take something of God's good created order and absolutize them. But then he talks about Christian Catholic social thinking and Abraham Kuyper's thinking as two Christian approaches that rise above this idolatry. And I have found his book personally very, very helpful. And I'm looking forward to interviewing him, like you're doing for me right now, on February the 9th at 6 p.m. in Amsterdam time.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we'll be sure to add it also in terms of when we send the stuff out and put in the description, so on all the activities people, our people can get involved in the Schuman Centre. We want to thank you so much for sharing this message with us. It's been incredibly enlightening in terms of a positive spirit and a positive future for Europe, and advancing that in the light of some very negative media. Most people tend to focus on that. So this has been WorldView. For our viewers, we want to thank you so much for watching. We've had absolute privilege today to talk with Jeff Fountain. If you've made it thus far, you've most definitely enjoyed the videos. So it would help out the channel a lot if you subscribe and like and so on and so forth. And also consider donating on Patreon. It's a platform that supports this channel and allows us to make many more of these videos to get everybody's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. So thank you so much for watching. This has been WorldView.